Have you ever heard of a war that wasn't fought with swords, guns, or soldiers, but instead entirely with words, diplomacy, and a sneaky game of manipulation? Buckle up, because today we're diving into one of the most bizarre and little-known conflicts in history, the Forgotten War Without Bullets. It's an episode of political chess that you'll find hard to forget. In the early 19th century, Europe was a hotbed of tension, power plays, and constant territorial disputes. But none could rival the curious case of the Strawberry War. Officially, it was known as the Oyster Wars, a territorial clash between two rival micronations over a muddy stretch of land in the Strait of Dover. Yes, a war about oysters. Let me explain. The strait, as you may know, is a thin body of water separating England and France. But back in the day, it wasn't just about geography, it was prime real estate for seafood. French fishermen claimed the oysters were culturally theirs, while English settlers believed the oysters were in British waters, and thus their rightful harvest. High stakes, right? And this isn't where the oddity ends. This wasn't even about oysters people were eating every day. It was about a particular rare, flashy, luxurious type known as pearl cap oysters, the caviar of their kind. Coveted by European royalty, these oysters weren't just food, they were status symbols. Now onto the spark of this unusual dispute. In 1812, a French fisherman named Jacques Bonnet hauled in what was said to be a record catch of these prized oysters. This treasure was allegedly taken just inches across a boundary line that was, at the time, entirely imaginary and highly contested. That catch didn't just make Jacques Bonnet wealthy, it sent political tempers into overdrive. Enter the two protagonists of our curious tale: British diplomat Lord Winterhall and French negotiator Pierre de Floret. These men were tasked with resolving what had escalated into a full-blown international crisis. The catch? Both nations refused to allow military involvement, quite forward-thinking if you ask me. So the conflict became a diplomatic tug-of-war instead. The meeting site to settle all this, a tiny nondescript island right in the middle of the strait, aptly nicknamed Oyster Island. It was here that both sides would send representatives armed not with swords, but with charisma, wit, and persuasive arguments. Now, let's talk about the characters in our story, because they were as colourful as the conflict itself. Lord Winterhall was known for his sharp tongue and love of theatrics. Legend has it he carried a good luck crystal in his pocket, which he occasionally consulted before making decisions. His French counterpart, Pierre de Floret, was equally eccentric, famous for his penchant for wearing outrageously tall hats that supposedly made him feel more authoritative. For months, the negotiations dragged on. While one might imagine heated debates and endless maps being drawn and redrawn, it was actually a comical stalemate. Meetings often dissolved into arguments about who had the better oysters. At one point, Winterhall allegedly quipped, "French oysters taste like they've been reading bad poetry," to which de Floret fired back, "English oysters merely aspire to poetry." The tone was mocking, but behind the banter lay genuine stakes. What made this so peculiar is authorities reported that any time either side got frustrated, they'd take strategic oyster breaks, consuming seemingly absurd amounts of oysters together, right along the argued-over fishing waters. Talk about eating the problem. Finally, after months of playful yet unproductive debates, the breakthrough moment happened over, of all things, a glass of brandy. It turns out, both men were avid connoisseurs of fine spirits, and during one blustery night, an impromptu competition ensued about who could polish off their snifter in more refined style. One thing led to another, and the two diplomats began sharing tales of their misadventures in courtship and their disdain for the pretentiousness of their own social elites. In that spirit of camaraderie, they drafted what would become known as the Oyster Pact. What was the resolution? Instead of taking ownership of the disputed land outright, both nations elected to make it an official shared territory operating under joint governance. Fishermen were required to purchase mutual licenses, and most importantly, half of the annual luxury oyster harvests were turned over to charity kitchens in both nations. The Oyster Pact was ahead of its time, an early example of collaborative diplomacy over conflict. So, who won this so-called war without bullets? You could argue both sides. England and France were able to maintain their national pride, the fishermen got a fair deal, and the oysters lived to see another day. Well, until they didn't. But the real winner, perhaps, was diplomacy itself, reminding us all that not every dispute needs to end in violence. Oh, and here's the kicker. Not long after the pact was finalized, pearl cap oysters experienced a sudden boom in demand thanks to, you guessed it, the very press coverage surrounding this quirky conflict. In a way, the war both saved and almost ended the oyster species. Isn't history bizarre? So what's the lesson here? From oysters to brandy, from witty insults to tall hats, this forgotten tale illustrates that wars don't always need bullets to end decisively. Sometimes, all you need is shared humanity and an absurd amount of seafood, and maybe a little brandy on the side. Does this sound like a trivial story? Perhaps. But trivial stories are often the ones that teach us the most about human nature. The next time someone tells you that history is all about kings and empires, just ask them about the forgotten war without bullets. Maybe we can all learn a thing or two about how to approach our own modern disagreements. That's it for today's episode of Historical Hidden Gems. What do you think? Would today's politicians resolve global tensions over a good meal and a glass of brandy? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embark on even more wild adventures through history.